Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to take a look at some very unique people who really lived up to the Profiles in Courage moniker. My guest today has done a book on these folks, and it's extremely interesting. Mr. Felix Dodds is an adjunct professor in environmental sciences and engineering at the University of North Carolina, and he is an associate fellow at the Tellus Institute in Boston, and he's also the international ambassador for the city of Bonn. He co-authored his recent book, Environmental Heroes in Diplomacy, Profiles in Courage. Felix Dodds, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thanks, Bill. Pleasure to be back.
I appreciate you being with me. You're writing so many books, we're going to have to give you your own show. We could do one a week almost on the books, but this one is a little bit different, but all your books are very unique, very informative, very interesting. But this one has in our subtitle, Profiles in Courage. Was this a takeoff on John F. Kennedy's Profiles in Courage book that was done, I guess, in 1956?
It was, and my co-editor, Chris Spence, had approached me to do this book while I was still finishing Tomorrow's People and New Technology. So I said to him, look, I'm too busy. But then I kind of thought about it. And it was just too delicious an idea not to be involved with. I mean, the idea of trying to do something similar to what JFK did, but for global environmental diplomacy. We looked at people, just as John F. Kennedy did, who went beyond their organization or their country and, in a sense, acted in his book on behalf of the country, and in this book, in half of the world. And, one of the things about heroes is we're most likely to see them wearing skin-hugging Lycra. And I can just say for the listeners, I'm not wearing Lycra at the moment. And they're more like the kind of Batmans and the Supermans of this world. And what we wanted to do was to look underneath, as JFK did, at who were these people? What did they do? And what was the impact that they had on the environmental agenda? And then what happened to them afterwards? That was the kind of remit we asked people who were writing chapters to take into consideration when they were looking at their hero.
Well, great launching pad. Why don't we just jump right into it? We won't be able to get through all of them, but pick out 6 or 7 of the top ones you'd like to focus on, and let's just go through it, and we'll go as far as we can go.
Well, I will pick a few out, and I'm not going to go into them in great depth because I think, the book holds together, but perhaps the one which it was the last chapter that came in, and it was the one on Sidney Holt. And unless you perhaps are involved in the issue of whaling, you would perhaps not know his name. But Holt worked for the International Whaling Commission for more than 30 years and is recognized as one of the most influential people in the fight to save whales from their extinction. He started in the 1960s as part of what was then in the International Whaling Commission known as the Three Wise Men. And he tried to work out a sustainable yield for each whale. He covered a number of attempts to do that, and he succeeded through his time period to get the moratorium on whaling and to create whale sanctuaries in the Indian and Southern Oceans. So we just literally would not probably have many of the whales if it hadn't been for his work. So it's a fascinating story into an individual. And he crossed over with the hero that I wrote, Maurice Strong, because Maurice went from the 1972 Stockholm Conference to the International Whaling Commission because whaling had been one of the big issues at the Stockholm Conference, and lended his voice and his support for the work that Sidney had done. Maurice, I focused more on the Rio +20. I mean, anyone who knows Maurice Strong's arc, he went as a youngster. He lived in the Great Depression in Canada. And his father, once the Depression started, never got a full-time job. He changed his birth certificate from 1929 to 1924 to try and get to fight in the Second World War. He hitched on freight trains over to Vancouver. He stowed away on a boat that was taking troops up to Alaska and ended up being used as a potato peeler in there. But he then ended up with the Hudson Bay Company in the north of Canada. And that was where he met the Inuits, and his kind of support for Indigenous peoples started. But his kind of major contribution in 92, and there were many, it could have been the climate conference, it could have been the biodiversity outcome.
That's a good point, Felix. Let's stop at 1992 on UNCED, the UN Conference on Environment and Development that was held in Rio de Janeiro. Give us a little background on that conference and why that there have been a lot of initiatives. I won't say most of them, but the vast majority of the major ones were launched by the United Nations or some part of the UN. But the UNCED conference is often viewed as really the launching pad for this whole discussion of climate change, sustainable development, and a variety of other terms that we're using today that we never even thought about prior to that. How did that develop at UNCED?
Well, so we don't necessarily go into those individual issues, but I do know enough to tell you. So the important thing here was that Morris had been the Secretary General of the Stockholm Conference in 1972, and he was very disappointed on the implementation of that conference outcome document. Governments didn't do what they had said they would do. So one of the things that, and we focused on in the chapter on this, is he, in a sense, recognized he needed the support of stakeholders to implement. So industry, local government, trade unions would be very important as implementation agents. He recognized that Indigenous people's voice needed to be heard and to be acted on, and that you needed a gender perspective, and that you needed young people and their voice to be held, and that you needed farmers to be involved because we were facing a food crisis, and that all these decisions needed to be made on strong science, and that finally that NGOs should be involved because they monitor government's implementation, but they're also implementation agents themselves. So the chapter focuses on that. But to answer your question, he managed to orchestrate, and I think this is partly because he'd done it before, a number of parallel processes. The main text that came out was 40 chapters called of Agenda 21, which was viewed as the blueprint for sustainable development going into the next century. He developed, or he engineered 27 principles called the Rio Declaration. That was meant to be an Earth Charter, but wasn't able to get to the level that he'd hoped. But those included the polluter pays principle of prior informed consent. He marshaled the negotiations on climate change and biodiversity so that they would come to a head at Rio, so that heads of state would sign them there. And there had been a hope for a third convention on forestry, but that unfortunately didn't happen. And we still have suffered more forest loss, probably because that wasn't possible. But all of that was a huge amount that was agreed by member states, and that he hoped that stakeholders would, in a sense, help deliver many of those agreements.
Mm-hmm. Now, another person you've flagged as a profile encouraged person is Paula Caballero. And Paula was on, in fact, she was on Global Connections Television. She's on our website at globalconnectionstelevision.com. Who was she and what did she do in dealing with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals to eliminate poverty, to eliminate hunger, to empower women, and different ones like that?
So her story is really interesting as well. I mean, she was she'd worked at UNDP prior to the position that she took.
UN Development Program.
Yeah, but prior to the point that she took in the Colombian government's foreign office, and she came up. I mean, she'd worked on the Millennium Development Goals while she had been at UNDP, and she recognized that focusing on a set of goals and targets was having an impact on helping governments to, in a sense, reduce poverty or to address water scarcity. And so her feeling was that the problem with the Millennium Development Goals was that they were sectorial and that they didn't cover as many of the issues that needed to be covered as should be. And so I was actually at the first meeting where she called for that, which was in Solo, Indonesia in July. In fact, it was literally the anniversary was yesterday when she made the statement that we should try and look for a set of sustainable development goals to work with the Millennium Development Goals in the review that would happen in 2015. And it was her power of persuasion in 2011, particularly in a number of meetings that were hosted either by herself or by a number of other governments to look at how we could strengthen the sustainable development element of the MDGs. And the MDGs differ from the SDGs because they apply to all countries. And they also look at the interlinkages between the goals and targets, which was something that the MDGs didn't. And she was able to get text into the Rio Plus 20 document that came out in June 2012, and that set in motion a process which ultimately saw the 17 goals. Many of them, if not all of them, are reflected in the Rio Plus 20 document, but in a sense, the depth of them and the kind of targets were what then were developed in 13 and 14, and then ultimately passed in 15.
And she was very instrumental in doing that.
Without her, it would not have happened. I mean, and without Rio Plus 20, though some people thought it a less successful summit, it needed to happen so that it would set in motion a process which would require the review of the Millennium Development Goals to be much broader than what was expected. At that particular time, most of the development community, whether it was the development agencies, USAID or DFID in the UK, were just interested in doing an MDG plus agenda. And what she wanted was a more fundamental look at what we needed to address as we move forward to 2030 and beyond.
Mm-hmm. I mentioned a minute ago how the UN has been instrumental in developing conferences. It's not the UN doing it, but bringing the parties of the world, the 193 countries of the UN General Assembly, the private sector, the public sector together, civil society, to focus on these problems, especially sustainable development problems and climate change in particular. And these conferences are extremely, extremely delicate, and they're very difficult at times because you have so many competing demands, so many different ideas, philosophies, what have you. And one of them was the Copenhagen Conference. And you mentioned in your book that Barack Obama, when he was president, was actively involved in that particular one, as a lot of US presidents have been over the years. What role did he play?
Well, I think that, there are 3 chapters on climate out of the 10. So the first one, I'm just going to go back a second and talk about Ralph Ostrada, who was from Kyoto. And as you will know, the US Senate voted against, I think, 100-0, implementing the Kyoto Agreement. But he managed to get a target for reducing carbon dioxide agreed, and it actually came into effect, I think, in 2005 when Russia, of all people, ratified the convention. But one of the stories that's in the book is Ralph Ostrada was seen as a successful chair of the negotiations. When he came back from his posting in Beijing, where he'd been the ambassador, and it was the time for the next climate meeting in 1998, his government was so unhappy with the role that he had played in facilitating the outcome, they demoted him from the chief negotiator to a driver of negotiators who would just pick them up and take them to the conference, and wasn't even given a pass to get into the conference. So, that's an example where governments perhaps they are not so happy about the role that their civil servant had played. He played the role for everybody, and his government were not happy with that. On President Obama, it's a fascinating event, the Copenhagen Climate Conference. I was there, and it was clear it was going nowhere. We could see the kind of the crash that was coming as we were going through each day. But what Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton both did, in a sense, was to set up Paris. The Copenhagen Accords, I mean, Barack Obama was there, I think, for just 24 hours. But what he did was he was trying to move from a situation where only developed countries would report to where everybody would report on their carbon dioxide emissions. So they were taking into consideration the decision of the US Senate, where it had called in 1997 for all countries to report. He was now trying to get that to happen. And he, in a sense, broke into a meeting of Brazil, I think, India, China, who were discussing what their viewpoints were. And he talked them into the idea of all countries that should report. Hillary Clinton, on the other hand, had helped to facilitate the idea of this 100 billion, which would be, in a sense, endorsed in Paris. So these two things were really important. The problem was that he hadn't involved all the countries in the discussion, and he'd by this time left to go on to another meeting. And so when it came in front of governments, they didn't endorse the Copenhagen Accords, they just noted them. And it took more than 5 years to actually get that to a global agreement, which was the Paris Climate Agreement.
And that was possibly the first step for that. So it's very important. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with the PBS or community access television station, or an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our shows and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're talking with Mr. Felix Dodds, who is an adjunct professor in environmental sciences and engineering at the University of North Carolina, about his recent book titled Environmental Heroes in Diplomacy, Profiles in Courage. Felix, these are really interesting profiles and very interesting people. But before we get, I think we're going to run out of time as I'm looking at the clock a bit, but I do want to get one question in that's a little bit off topic. Well, not really off topic, but to some degree. You were just at a major conference, a climate conference in Bonn, Germany, not long ago. And what exactly was the purpose of the Bonn Climate Change Conference, and what came out of it? What suggestions, what proposals can we look forward to learning more about?
As you can see, I have the backdrop of the Bonn Climate Conference behind me. So when the process for any climate COP always starts in Bonn. There's always every single year a two-week meeting to prepare the text that then goes to the COP, which is usually in November or December. So this was what is the normal process, and it consists of a number of bodies that will meet and prepare what will ultimately be what will be finally negotiated, in this case in Sharm el-Sheikh in November. So the backdrop, of course, is that certain things were succeeded, or there was a success for them in the context of the Glasgow Climate COP, particularly the decision on setting up carbon markets, which had taken a long time. There were a number of issues which were, in a sense, pushed on to this year to look at. One of them was loss and damage, and that process didn't go particularly well in Bonn, and so I'm assuming that there'll be some inter-sessional additional work to try and move that forward. And so loss and damage deals with clearly the historical nature of the damage caused by climate change, particularly on developing countries, and whether or not there should be a historical payment for that damage where developed countries have, in a sense, caused the problems that developing countries are now facing. That process, I think, will continue forward. And I think there won't be I don't think there'll be a success in Sharm el-Sheikh. I think it'll be part of an ongoing process. It'll take more than one COP to agree that. There was an agreement that countries would continue to improve their targets for the Sharm el-Sheikh conference. And unfortunately, I've not seen much evidence of that. We'll have to see whether that changes between now and the conference. And if you remember the Glasgow conference, a number of countries made their increased targets available just short of the conference. So we hope that would happen. There was also the beginning of a process, I think, on agriculture. In the climate negotiations, there's been the Kyoto work program on agriculture, clearly a huge area for carbon sinks and a big controversial area, but there was a number of workshops that were set up from the Spanish COP through the Glasgow COP. And so the decision here will be not whether they will come up with some conclusions, but whether they will set in motion a process that can have conclusions. So with some of these things, they take a long time for them to come to an agreement that we would like to see. There'll be an urban summit, I think, of urban ministers very shortly, if not this week. So the Egyptian COP presidencies are working with the UK COP presidency, and they're trying to move some of the issues that were not resolved through the Bonn conference. I have to say that the mood in Bonn was not necessarily good, because the impact of the war in the Ukraine is going to have a big impact on what we are able to see as CO2 reductions. As many of you know, it's also having an impact on the availability of food. So we're expecting a food crisis by the end of this year. And we're already seeing gas prices extremely high all around the world. Whether that helps accelerate the use of alternatives, we'll have to see.
It's a mind-boggling to see how a conflict in just one small area of the world can affect literally prices all around the world, food supplies. We see right now what the Ukrainian war has done is driven up gas prices just 24% alone. If really each gallon of gas would cost about $1 less if this war were not going on. Countries in Africa are not able to get the food that they normally would get from Ukraine. Ukraine is a breadbasket, not only for Ukraine and that area of the world, but also many other parts of the world, including the United States. So we can see this, and coupled with all of this, we're watching right now as but Secretary General Antonio Guterres of the United Nations said the other day, when he basically cajoled the member states, the governments, to get moving and to start focusing on this climate change problem. We see what it was 104 degrees in London the other day. Fires are raging in Spain and France. You've got drought conditions literally all around the world. The Po River in Italy is drying up. As Guterres said, this is suicide. We're watching a suicide take place. Do you agree with him?
I do. And I think we're already past 1.1 degree rise. So we have to pull this back very quickly. And the problem we have is just enormous at the moment. There are, of course, good stories. I mean, the move towards electric cars is happening much quicker than we had seen. Pretty much every car manufacturer will have them out this year or next year. So that's good. There's clearly been more money put into renewables, and it just needs to be accelerated. If Manchin hadn't stopped the Build Back Better bill from going through, then we would be in a much better place in the United States in a sense, creating electricity infrastructure that was linked into renewable energy. So there's a lot to do, and a lot of good jobs. It's not just bad news. I mean, if we move to clean technology, the amount of new good jobs that make the workers not ill from what they're producing, but actually very happy that they're contributing to a more sustainable and just world.
Felix, that was an excellent exit point right there. You laid it out and you talked about the problems, especially the dysfunctionality of the United States Senate in the United States. But these are issues we're going to have to deal with very well. We should have dealt with them yesterday and years ago. But Felix, congratulations on your new book, Environmental Heroes in Diplomacy, Profiles in Courage. And I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and very informative program.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.